Colossus is the most advanced lineup optimizer in daily fantasy sports. Lock and exclude players. Adjust player exposure to reduce risk of injury or poor performance. Customize individual projections or upload your own projections. Generate hundreds of optimal lineups in seconds. Name and save the best lineups. Create winning lineups for the top sites like DraftKings and FanDuel for free at dailyfantasycafe.com.
Hello and welcome to the FanDuel Punch-Out. I'm Big Italy 42 here talking about this short little slate as we usually see on Thursday nights. Just 7 games on tap and a couple of them with decent-sized totals and some good matchups. And as far as elite pitching, there's really only one guy on the mound, and he doesn't have a great matchup. He's a guy who hasn't made a start since the 29th of August. It's Corey Kluber, $11,000 for him tonight against Kansas City, who, as we know, strikes out less than any other team in baseball. He's a small minus 127 favorite and a 7-run total. I mean, he's probably your safest option on tonight's slate because he is the most talented pitcher, but at the same time, not a great matchup. Carrasco and Tomlin over the last 2 days, though, had some success against this same team, so it's quite possible that he has himself a fine game, and I do expect that he will, but I'm not expecting a huge, 12-14 type strikeout performance in this one against this team, and you don't expect it's going to get a ton of run support because your Donovan Ventura has actually been very good over the last 30 days. 30.4% strikeout rate. Still a high walk rate at over 10%, but 13.5% swing and strike rate. 54.5 ground ball rate. He's having a great month. Really pitching well over the past 30 days. So he's a guy who still, through the course of the season, has some issues with left-handed batters, which we'll get into with some of these Cleveland batters, of course, but I do think Kluber, probably your safest option, just depending on whether you want to pay up or not, if you're going to be paying for bats. Another guy that's interesting, John Lackey, $8,600. We know the story with him. He's a minus 145 favorite, 7.5 run total. He's just Mr. Consistency. Not a guy that's going to give you a whole lot of upside, but not a guy that's going to really kill you either. Right about league average, we're better in a lot of ways. Over the past 30 days, though, 12.1% swing and strike rate, strikeout rate of over 23%. You got to like that. His season numbers nowhere near that, 18.7% strikeout rate, and the swing and strike rate is just 9.4. So obviously you don't anticipate him maintaining those numbers throughout the rest of the season, but certainly a guy at $8,600 that you could feel good about, probably getting you 10 to 12 points, maybe even more if you can get the win here with Jimmy Nelson on the other side, who, as we know, struggles with left-handed batters. Quite a few good left-handed batters in this Cardinals lineup. So other guys to consider, I mentioned Donovan Ventura kind of in passing there. $8,500. Hasn't been great over his last 2 starts, but was tremendous over the 2 before that. So he's a guy that, this night just screams GPP to me. Obviously can make cash game teams, but short slate like this, I think this is going to be a really fun one because there's no obvious play where everyone's looking at one pitcher. There are some fairly obvious hitters, but I think it's going to be a fun night for GPPs. I think if you're going cash game route, there's some obvious guys that you can just slot in and just decide whether or not you're going to pay up for pitcher or not. But I think Lackey and Kluber are probably your most safe options there. Other guys you can consider, there really aren't many of them. Marco Estrada is the biggest favorite on the day, but at $8,700, you don't love it. Facing Atlanta, obviously in Atlanta, that's fine. But over the last 30 days, though, this guy's allowing a 58.1% fly ball rate and 2.51 home runs per 9. That's not what you want out of your starting pitcher. Obviously, this game in Atlanta, not nearly the hitter's park that Rogers Center is, but Estrada just not a guy that I like to play. Fly ball rate of that magnitude and giving up way too many home runs, even in this ballpark, I'm not a big fan. If he was more like 7K, 7,500, maybe I'd be more inclined to play him, but at almost 9K, you're shooting for big time upside here, which he has upside, but I just don't love his downside. Not a great floor for him. Lance McCullers is a guy who's been up and down. He's $8,700, 9-run total, biggest one on the night. Pitching in Texas. This is a scenario that I'm not a big fan of on either side as far as pitchers. Dallas Keuchel, his worst start of the season last night. By far, actually. And with the hot weather and everything there, and both offenses swinging decent bats recently, I just am not a big fan of this. Texas exploded yesterday. Got Prince Fielder's hot. A lot of these other guys hitting well. He's a GPP option for you there, but at almost $9,000, just not a guy that I feel good about at all. Only other guy you really could consider, and I don't feel great about him either, but he certainly has some upside. Tommy Malone, whatever you want to call him, $7,000, facing off against an Angels team that just hasn't been good against lefties or righties. Looking at his past 30 days, 18% strikeout rate, 10.5% swinging strike rate, ground ball rate of almost 40, and a hard hit rate of just 26%. He's been good, adequate for that price. So if he continues to pitch, similarly tonight, then I think he's going to be in a good spot for some GPPs at that price. I'm really not a fan of any of these other cheap guys. I'll probably be targeting most of them. Looking over at catcher, this is the perfect night to pay down at catcher. I mean, you can certainly look at guys like Evan Gattis, but Colby Lewis has actually been really good against right-handed batters. 309 WOBA. I mean, it's about average, I guess you could say, but it is his better split. Has allowed 13 home runs to righties, so I think if there's one guy I'm paying up for, it will be Gattis. I'm really not a fan of these other guys. I mean, JP Arancibia, I don't even anticipate that he's going to be in the lineup for sure. He certainly could be. He's been playing almost every day recently, $3,200. And against Chris Tillman, the righty-righty matchup, you like that in tournaments. So he's certainly a guy you consider. But I'm looking down. I'm looking at Jacob Realmuto as a guy for some GPP upside going up against Tanner Roark. Tanner Roark has really struggled in a small sample size this season against right-handed batters. He's had a 302 WOBA, but he's allowed 6 home runs already. So this is a spot that I'm looking to target guys with power. Obviously, this game being in Washington. I like Realmuto. He's a guy that hits lefties better than righties, but he's a guy with a ton of power, and there's not a lot of power guys at catcher tonight. So certainly a guy that I'm looking to pick on there. Roark, like I mentioned, is about average against righties. What I meant to say was he's terrible against lefties. Obviously, we'll be getting to that in a minute. Got a few guys there on the board. And Matt Wieters is a guy you can look at against the lefty, and Matt Moore. Matt Moore has not been very good in small sample size. In fact, against righties this season, a 446 WOBA, obviously. Absolutely terrible, and Wieters being a switch hitter, certainly going to be his better side there. And then Wilson Ramos at $2,300 against Cozart. Cozart, like another one of these guys who hasn't pitched a whole lot this season, but 349 WOBA, small sample size against righties. But the guy that I'm looking at the most, probably the cash game play, assuming he's in, and he should be, as a switch hitter against Matt Wisler, who, might quite possibly be the worst pitcher in all of baseball against left-handed batters. 450 WOBA allowed, 9 homers in his 36 and 2/3 innings. And Dioner Navarro comes in at absolute minimum salary, $2,200, switch hitter for the Blue Jays. We've seen these situations before where he gets in a lineup in a great matchup like this. We see him bat 5th or 6th. If he's batting 5th or 6th, you got to imagine his cash game ownership is going to be through the roof, as it should be. So I'm expecting him to play. That's not to say Russell Martin might not DH or something like that, but he's definitely my favorite play if he's in the lineup as far as the cheap guys go. First base options, it's hard to look past Chris Davis, even though it is a lefty-lefty matchup. We keep mentioning this. He's hit lefties very well this season, so he's a guy you can certainly consider. You can look at Edwin Encarnacion, but Whistler, despite his struggles, his mighty struggles against lefties, it's actually been pretty solid against righties, a 293 WOBA allowed. But obviously, these big bats all in play in tournaments. Certainly not paying $5K for Edwin Encarnacion in a cash game. If you're going to pick on Corey Kluber at all, which I'm not really recommending, but it would be with left-handed bats, so Kendrys Morales or Eric Hosmer, if you want to throw one of those in a GPP, it is a small slate. All you really need is one of these guys to get one big hit and pay off for you in your GPPs. But the guy I'll be playing the most at first base, got to be Prince Fielder. Absolutely on fire right now. 10 hits over his last 4 games, including 3 home runs and 8 RBIs. 9 runs scored through that span as well. Guy's absolutely locked in. He's way too cheap. I love that. Justin Smoke, switch hitter, will be hitting from the left side against Matt Wisler. Another guy that I'm expecting will be in the lineup for Toronto. Now, another lefty that we could pick on, a guy who struggles with lefties, Matt Adams. Should be in the lineup tonight, I would hope. He didn't start yesterday. He's only actually made 1 start so far since his return. $2,800, though. We know the story with Jimmy Nelson. 374 WOBA allowed to lefties. That's where you pick on him, and I think he's a great way to go. And one more guy to throw out here that's cheap, Justin Bour against Tanner Roark. Bour's had a couple big games in a row, and Roark, 373 WOBA allowed to lefties, right up there with Jimmy Nelson. I think that's a great spot for Justin Bour if you're going to be paying down. But like I said, Prince Fielder, the guy I'm playing more often than not. Once again, a lefty against Tanner Roark, and that's D. Gordon at $3,900. This guy, obviously, big-time stolen base upside. Hit a home run 2 games ago. He's got multi-hits in 3 straight. This guy can do it all. You got to pay quite a bit for him tonight, but this isn't a night I'll be likely paying very much for pitchers outside of Kluber in a few spots. It's impossible to pay because there's just no one else that's expensive, so it's not hard to fit a guy like that in your lineup. Rookie Odor at $3,300 against McCullers. McCullers has had some issues against left-handed batters here this season. So, or I'm sorry, McCullers has had his issues with righties. I'm looking at that one backwards. But definitely Rugi Odor still in play for me, though, because McCullers, we've seen he's got his upside, but when he's bad, he's bad. And I think that's a good spot for Odor, despite the fact that he bats down order. Anthony Rendon continues to hit well. He's $3,300. He's got multi-hits in 4 of his last 5, so he's a great spot. But I think the popular play in the cash games, it's got to be Brian Dozier, facing off against Hector Santiago. He's $2,900. Santiago has allowed 22 home runs to right-handed batters this season already. And over the past 30 days, right up there with Marco Estrada, 58.9% fly ball rate, 16.7% walk rate. Whole lot of bad right now for Hector Santiago. Twins righties, going to be some of the better plays on the night. Jason Kipnis, Yordano Ventura, like I mentioned, has been good, but throughout the course of the season, hasn't been great against lefties. So I think that's a decent play for you there. And looking down cheap, Colton Wong, another St. Louis lefty against Nelson. And if you want a tournament play, Ryan Goins probably going to bat about 7th, but he is a lefty against Matt Whistler, and I'm going to get as many of those lefties as I possibly can against him. Goins isn't a guy with huge upside, but certainly batting in that Toronto order, if they get it going today, I mean, it seems like every lefty is getting on base against Whistler. So definitely a guy to consider if you're paying down. Third base options, for me, it's Miguel Sano at the top. Not even particularly close. Hitting well recently. Mentioned Santiago's struggles this season and even recently, so he's in a great spot. Josh Donaldson, I mean, the same old story with him. You always consider him in your tournaments if you can afford him, but not a guy that I'm going to force into my lineups. Matt Carpenter, another lefty, hit another homer and also had 2 doubles last night. Huge game. Now he gets a great matchup against Jimmy Nelson. Still at Miller Park. That's a great spot for him. Manny Machado against the lefty Matt Moore. Machado, we know, has had those reverse splits, but he's been solid against lefties as well. Looking at some other options here, you can look at Adrian Beltre against Lance McCullers. He's $2,900. Beltre's been hot recently, and facing off against McCullers, his 322 WOBA, I mean, is not bad against righties, but obviously this game being in Texas, highest total. Guy like Beltre under 3K is certainly a guy you need to have on your radar. Derek Dietrich's another lefty against Tanner Roark. He's only $2,500. He's got some upside, some pop in his bat as well. I have to talk about my boy Lonnie Chisenhall, assuming that he's in the lineup. Also $2,500 against Ventura. Not a great matchup, but short slate, you got to consider everybody. Trevor Plouffe in there as well at $2,800 as another third base option. Shortstops here, there's not a whole lot to like. Gotta love Francisco Lindor. He just continues to mash the ball. Switch hitter against Ventura. Swear I'm not picking on him, but we only have 7 games, so you gotta pick your spots, and Lindor's got to be price considered your best option at shortstop. Of course, Carlos Correa in that conversation as well against Colby Lewis, but Lindor, I mean, he's just been in better form recently. He's been seeing the ball very well. Eduardo Escobar, you can consider, of course, switch hitter against Santiago. I'm picking on Santiago with anybody who's got any sort of power. And Escobar doesn't have a ton, but he has shown some recently, so I like that. Ian Desmond is a righty against Cosart. Well, you know, he always has home run upside. I'm not loving any of these cheap guys. As you know, Marvin Gonzalez, kind of my go-to cheaper guy at 25. He's really the only cheap guy that I'm a fan of. You got Andrelton Simmons down there against Estrada, but Estrada's been good against righties, despite the fact he gives up too many fly balls. So I just really don't love that. You can look at Eric Ibar at 2,200 if you have to against the lefty and Malone, but even he, I mean, he's an average hitter at best against lefties there. Looking at the outfield, of course, you're looking at Bryce Harper. I mean, the guy's been absolutely locked in. 4 home runs in his last 3 games, 7 total hits. He's 5,700. Isn't that hard to fit tonight, though, if you want him. Jose Bautista, tournament only, of course, at 5,100 there. Some other guys, if Ryan Braun, he was a late scratch yesterday. If he sits out, that bumps up John Lackey. But if he plays, certainly a tournament option. You prefer him against the lefty, but he's his sort of upside's always in play. Michael Brantley, you can look at, but I don't love him tonight at his price at $4,200. Mike Trout's only $4,000 against Tommy Malone, the lefty. He's, over the past couple weeks, really hasn't been great, but he's still showing some pop. Got a couple homers in his last 10 games. So $4,000 for arguably the best hitter in baseball. Still got to keep him on your short list there. Jason Worth, absolutely locked in. 4 home runs in his last 3 games. 2 on Monday and 2 on Wednesday. The guy's locked in. 3,600. He's going to be a popular play tonight, and for good reason. Same goes for Jason Hayward. He's $3,600 also. Went 0 for 4 last night, but you can't be looking at these game logs. You got to be looking at the matchup. It's a great one with Jimmy Nelson, so he's a guy on my short list. Christian Yelich is another lefty from Miami against Tanner Roark. I think that's a sneaky stack tonight. And then you're looking at some lefties from Texas that are in okay spots against McCullers. I mentioned McCullers has been solid against lefties, but I'm looking at both sides of this one still. Shin-Soo Choo, Mitch Moreland, both those guys hitting the ball well. On the Minnesota side, looking at switch hitting Aaron Hicks at $3,100 with some upside once again against Santiago. On the Houston side, looking at Colby Rasmus with $2,900. You know he's got a ton of pop in his bat. Ben Revere, I mean, very little upside as far as his bat, but he's got upside on the base paths, and he's $2,900 and a lefty against Matt Whistler, so he is instantly on my radar. You got your lefty mashers from Baltimore against Matt Moore. You got Adam Jones at $2,800. You got Steve Pearce down at $2,400. Those guys are great plays as well. And then one more guy I'm going to throw out there for a tournament. I like Steven Souza at $2,500 against Chris Tillman, who has had some issues with right-handed batters in a big way this season. And then your cheap guys, they all seem to be Cardinals here. You got John Jay down there at absolute minimum salary. You've got Brandon Moss as some upside down there. And then Tommy Pham, he's a righty, and Nelson much better against righties, but Pham's been absolutely locked in recently. 3 homers over his last 2 games. Maybe they ride with the hot hand, and I think he's certainly worth a look at minimum salary there. All right, that's going to wrap it up. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We got lots of great content for college football, NFL, Major League Baseball, PGA, everything at dailyfantasycafe.com.